Okay, welcome to Europe, part 3. I'm going to break this unit down into actually 4 parts, I think, and try and make them smaller and more manageable for you. Hopefully this will help you being able to view them more easily. So we're going to talk about cultural cohesion, or cultural geography, I should say, for Europe. This is an interesting region because one of the things we talked about where there is a lot of similarities historically. This is a really small region, land-wise, and yet the cultures are not very homogenous. If we, I think if you look at the United States, we've got this huge landmass, and we have a lot of similarities with Canada, although we have technically 2 sections of Canada. I think a lot of people view, especially, from English-speaking Canada, there's a lot of similarities. So we've got this huge landmass with a lot of similarities. These are small countries, relatively small countries, very culturally distinct, linguistically distinct. And a big part of that is also based on a pride of their distinctions and their differences. So historically speaking, there has been a lot of conflict that has arisen from these cultural differences. Another thing that we've seen regarding culture is for hundreds of years, European countries went and colonized other countries. And then depending on, different states of independence or conflict, a lot of people from colonies, from previous former colonies or current colonies were actually allowed to immigrate back to England, for example, or France, especially England is a good example. So you have this huge influx at certain points over the last 100 years of people coming in from other countries, which then has, it's worked. There's this resistance, you would say, as soon as we're talking about the European culture has spread globally with colonization, but then as you've seen that come back in, you've gotten, as we would say, mixed acceptance and resistance to outside global culture. One of the things that we'll talk about in this lecture that I think it would be most predominantly found in the news, especially because the EU in general, European countries take in a lot more asylum seekers and refugees. There's a lot more conflict regarding immigration, assimilation, and this is especially in the last couple of years as we've seen this more nationalistic trend and pattern that a lot of countries have been leaning towards, much as in our own country has. So geographies of language. Language is an interesting component of Europe. If you've ever been to Europe and traveled across, you can literally drive through a country, multiple countries in a day, and you can get out of your car at a gas station in every country, and the languages change, which isn't, makes sense. But it's not. It's something very unfamiliar from an American perspective. However, generally speaking, at a larger scale, Indo-European languages are dominant. It's about 90% of the people speak Indo-European languages. And then there's been a lot of, it's really interesting to see the evolution of languages and how they have changed with different invasions over time. So English is actually a low form of German. German as well as Latin, for example, have a high and a low, or kind of an informal and formal. If you speak Spanish, it's not the difference between like tú and usted. So it's not like it's not just in how you, the words you would use to describe somebody, or whether or not you add an S. It's a bit more complicated than that, but not a whole lot. So English is technically evolved from Low German, not High German. Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish evolved from Low Latin, which is why there's a lot of similarities. So those would be, English is a Germanic language, we would call it. And then Italian, Portuguese, Spanish are all Romance languages. So you can see here on the right, the majority of the countries speak Indo-European languages, which are all Germanic languages, so English, German, Dutch, Flemish, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic. We've got Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, are some of the more common ones. Portuguese, Slavic languages, Polish, Czech, Slovak, Slovenian, Greek, Celtic languages, so Gaelic, Irish, Welsh, Baltic languages, Albanian as well, and then you have non-Indo-European languages such as Basque, Uralic languages, and Turkic. And then English, generally speaking, is the new lingua franca. So if you remember what lingua franca is, it's generally like a language that's used for business, which is really interesting because now your book was published before Brexit, but it was 2 summers ago where 2 or 3 summers ago now, the UK took a vote and decided to leave the EU. So it is interesting that the language that is most commonly taught as a first language belongs to the one European Union country that is leaving, the first ever to request to leave the European Union. So one of the things that is distinct is multiple languages. This is a very plurilingual, or not even bilingual, trilingual, multilingual region of the world. Probably not so much as you would find actually in Africa, but generally speaking, most people do speak at least a foreign language of some varying degree. Depends on the generation as well. So we talked about Germanic languages here briefly on the last slide. It's really interesting as well to see, I think with England is a good example. So you've had Norman invasions at different times. You've had Vikings and French, and there's different historical tribes that were there. So there's a lot of different influences on the British English. But again, Germanic had a low and a high version. Romance languages as well have, and it's usually the low language. This is why you see the spread and why we talked about it's actually being evolved from the low language, because it was the low language that then was taken more to other places through either soldiers or different types of conquests and colonization. It wasn't necessarily taught formally in a school. And then we have the Slavic language, which actually uses a Cyrillic alphabet rather than what we would call a traditional alphabet. What do we call? I can't remember what the name of our alphabet is. Religion. Religion. We talked about when we were in the Middle East last week, which is the birthplace of Christianity. But Christianity pretty quickly spread throughout Europe. And today, a lot of times we think about Israel and Palestine being a religious conflict, but realistically, that's more ethnic conflict. However, in Europe, a lot of what we view today to be current ethnic tensions are actually related. You have to go back and start peeling away the layers of history to understand that a lot of the conflict is actually related to historical religious events. So one of the biggest ones, and I'm not talking about 20, 30, 40, even 100 years ago, but we're talking about hundreds of years ago, 500 years ago, and even 1,000 years ago. So the Catholic Church was very strong and has been very strong. And a lot of the conflicts that we see actually are a lot of times people separating from the Catholic Church. So one of the first big ones that we've seen was the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. And this was, you can see the Eastern Orthodoxies are the yellow countries, the light yellow countries, or the light yellow regions. So basically, there was a form of Christianity that had existed, and they were, the people, especially the Greeks, for example, were rebelling, and I should actually, probably a more appropriate word would be resisting Catholic priests coming in at different times where countries were taken over by previous countries. This was about 1,000 years ago. And it was actually this resistance of this imposing Catholic Church that you saw this more formal division between Eastern and Western Christianity. And then we saw the Protestant Revolution about 500 years later, so about 1500s. This is often associated with the invention of the printing press. So with the Protestant Revolution, if you're not familiar, there was a man named Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but anyways, Martin Luther was a Catholic priest or a clergy member. I'm not sure exactly. I don't remember exactly what his status was. I believe he was a priest. But anyways, he was disgruntled, you could say, with the teachings of the Catholic Church, because he said, well, this isn't what the Bible says. The Bible says this, but we're not teaching this, or we're not practicing this. So he actually then used the printing press. It's a really interesting story, but he used the printing press to go, I think it was like 80 teachings. I can't remember how many it was, but he went and actually pointed out a bunch of different differences. And then he started disseminating that information because he went to the Catholic leaders. They basically rejected him. And eventually what that led to was a separation from the Catholic Church. And today what we refer to as the Protestant Revolution, which is then referred to as Protestantism, and then even more so, Lutheran is like a sub-branch of Protestantism. It's interesting as well. The United Kingdom here is clumped under Protestantism. I'm not sure how the Church of England would technically classify themselves. That's a really interesting story, and it's a bit off topic. I don't want to go into it. But if you look up King Henry VIII, I'm pretty sure it was the 8th. If it wasn't the 8th, it might have been the 5th. But anyways, it was this English king, and he was married to a Spanish princess. And she was the niece of, I think, like a pope or an archbishop or a very high political person within the Catholic Church. And she had a daughter, and I think maybe a couple of miscarriages, and she didn't give him a son. So he wanted to get a divorce. Well, you don't really easily get divorced from the daughter or from the niece of a Catholic elder, and on top of it, the Princess of Spain. So he actually separated from the Catholic Church, created his own church, which then became the Church of England. So it's actually a really interesting story. It's a bit of a soap opera. It goes on where he married somebody else, and she had a daughter, and so he went ahead and actually accused her of being a witch and beheaded her, and he's got an interesting story. And this is actually, through this, we've got then Queen Elizabeth, our previous Queen Elizabeth, not direct descendant of the current, or ancestor of the current Queen Elizabeth. The term Bloody Mary also comes from this king's first daughter, who took over and reverted the country back to Catholicism. But anyways, look it up. It's a really interesting read. In conflicts with Islam, as well as Judaism, have a long-standing history within the country. Generally speaking, and historically speaking, Islam has been a lot more accepting of outside religions, Judaism as well as Catholicism, it's Christianity as well. Whereas the Christian sector has not nearly been as accepting of Islam as has been reciprocating. I don't think we can quite talk about religions of Europe without talking about Judaism. So Jews were spread for quite a while throughout different parts of Europe. They were exiled from what again today is Palestine and Israel. And a lot of Jews ended up in what they refer to as the Jewish Pale. Do I have a map? Sorry, I don't have them. Oh, here you go. So this is the former Jewish Pale, this area up here. Basically, the Jews spent a lot of time immigrating from one country, and for a while southern Spain especially, was predominantly Muslim, a lot of Jews lived there, and then they were constantly being persecuted and constantly looking for places where they could pretty much live in peace. So they ended up here in what we call this Jewish Pale. And the majority lived there. It was about 90% of Jews lived in that particular area. They lived in Europe until World War II, when the Nazi and during Nazi Party exterminated it's estimated that they exterminated over 6 million Jews, and a lot then fled. Today, it's only about, I want to say about 10%, maybe even less, of the world's Jewish population actually lives within Europe. So again, a lot did go and resettle to Israel. A lot immigrated to North America as well as some other regions. In this history that we've seen throughout the country, especially with a lot of the cultural revolutions and political revolutions, the monarchy, a lot of these countries had monarchies, and they were also in charge of the church, a representative of the church. And a lot of these, what we saw over time, has led to the concept of secularism. So a lot of Europe is secular, where you see this clear distinction of separation of state from religious institutions, and vice versa, a separation of religious institutions from state. Some countries, this is much more accepted in Eastern Europe, not quite nearly as much as it is in Western Europe, but a lot of countries, much as what we've seen was a foundation of our own country in the United States, was a clear distinction, a separation between the church and state. So this is now visible in a lot of Western European countries, but not so much in Eastern European countries. So I think a lot of times, from an American perspective, we think about migrants and immigrants coming from Europe to the United States, and we don't really think about a lot of times the immigrants who are still going to Europe. So a lot of, much as you would see with some major cities here within the United States, New York City, for example, comes to mind, which is very typical of a lot of immigrant places or areas with immigrant populations, I should say. There's a clustering, and you get the development of ethnic neighborhoods, Chinatown, if you will. One thing that has been interesting over the last, especially couple of decades, is this huge influx in immigration regarding Islamic or Muslim immigrants. There's been a big pushback, and this is for a variety of reasons. This is not just the fact that they're immigrants and a lack of cultural assimilation, but this is also growing tendencies and nationalistic ideologies. This is, again, this you could think about the discourse and how we associate. I mean, if we say Muslim, somewhere in your mind, the word terrorist is going to pop up. You might not go to directly think, oh, well, Muslims are terrorists, but at the least, you hear about this and you read about this in the media. Even if you do not associate Muslims as being terrorists, even if you take a stance that, Muslims are not terrorists, those are fundamental, it's a fundamental Islam that have terror, that supports terrorism, for example, there still is that association, right? And so this has led to an interesting series of restrictions on Muslim attire, predominantly for women. So the hijab, even going just for headscarves. And there's some really interesting, not good interesting, but really interesting pattern. There's the burkini, for example. I don't know if you've ever heard of a burkini. So it's really, I mean, I don't have to say, even in Hawaii, if I go to the beach, I tend to cover up. My boyfriend looks at me like I'm insane, but I don't want to get sunburned, A. And B, sunscreen is really bad for the ocean unless you're buying super special sunscreen. And even then, chemicals we're putting on our body, then we jump in the ocean and it gets into the water. So me being the environmentalist that I am, I just prefer to cover up the areas I can and reduce the amount of sunscreen I have to use. But there's been a lot of backlash, especially in France. So it's an interesting, different cultural perspective where you can go to the beach, nude beach, topless beach. You can go wear string bikinis. You can be very revealing regarding your bodies, but you can't cover up. You cannot wear a burkini, which is basically, think of, trying to think of the material, not like the rash guard material. It's not neoprene, but you wear like a rash guard material, and it'd be pants and then a long shirt. And it's usually a baggy shirt. It's not form-fitting necessarily. A little bit form-fitting, but not ridiculously form-fitting. And then there's also a cap, like a veil, a scarf, not a veil, sorry, a scarf, a headscarf that would be worn to cover your hair. And these have been outlawed to the extent where people can be like, imagine a police officer coming up to you on the beach and asking you to remove your clothes because it's illegal to wear that many clothes on the beach. And then as we see this, we also have seen this growing neo-nationalistic trend in Europe. A lot of elections that have been coming up in the last couple of years, and a lot of elections that are continuing to come up over the next few years, you get this very right side, right-leaning nationalistic policies. A lot of people would say this is also fueling current, that you have a very clear distinction, a very almost division and within a fission within our own country, within the United States, of separating people, separating political parties. And there is for the right-leaning side, a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the discourse and the words and the vocabulary they're using is what we would call neo-nationalistic. So take a few minutes, push pause. I'd like you to watch this quick video, which can sum it up a lot better than you just listening to me ramble on about attitudes towards Muslims in Europe. And then this other short video about growth of neo-nationalistic political parties. And this is also the same thing that fueled when you really look at it, right? They're not saying that they're neo-nationalistic, but when you get down and look at the motives, a lot of the motivations that was behind Brexit, a lot of it is based in neo-nationalistic ideologies. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and we'll finish the last part with geopolitics. Have a good day.